like working with you guys at IORA and VERTIVER, because we have a great kind of a constellation here, a triumvirate, you know. I come in with some basic science stuff from a university, and then Swapan makes that actionable science by putting it on the ground, and your organization helps explain it and maybe even convince people about the truth of it, you know, about the value of all that, and that's bringing it all together, that kind of integrationist.
Hi, we are thrilled to have Dr. Skole from Michigan State University today and Swapan Mehra from IORA Ecological Solutions. Both these gentlemen have been working together for 10 years in some of the most innovative paths to forestry in India. Dr. Skole, could we begin by talking about the urgency of action and the role you see in forestry and climate mitigation?
Sure, there is an urgency, and I think it all kind of boils down to one thing, and that is that if we don't reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, then the Earth will continue to warm, and the scientific evidence is that if the average temperature of the Earth rises above 1.5 degrees centigrade, which doesn't seem like a lot, right? But the average of the whole planet rises by that much, we could see tremendous changes in weather conditions, storm events, all kinds of things that are related to a highly energized hydrologic cycle, and much more opportunities for droughts and even intense rains. And so we need to do something to avert that. Even if humanity will survive, it'll cost a lot of money, right? So it'll have impact on the GNP. So the scientific community is saying that we need to have an aggressive plan to reduce emissions, and we need to do that so that we reach zero emissions, we completely decarbonize by the year 2050. This is what the IPCC is telling us. The problem with that is that other studies that look at whether that's feasible or not, by doing economic studies, show that even if you go across the entire economy with transport and agriculture and forestry and manufacturing, all that, and the most aggressive emissions reductions occurs, we still will have residual emissions. We won't be at zero. And so what we need to do is we need to implement actions that pull down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? And you do that by tree planting, by using biotic or nature-based solutions for getting us to that. And I think Swapan would agree that urgency is real. And we need to kind of really implement both the emission reductions and the nature-based solutions simultaneously right now.
So what are the two of you working on right now?
We are now focusing on picking up and revamping the MRV, measurement reporting verification system, that we started working on back in the day, a decade ago, and turn that into a machine learning-led, really accurate web-based system, which has plugins, which has access for project developers, countries around the world to just connect to and get an assessment of what is the tree carbon stock that they have on their lands, how much can they increase the tree carbon stock, so future projections by planting certain trees, and on a real-time basis get an assessment of what carbon stands on their ground. So the other big advantage that we have now over the last decade is that when we started working, we were all making a huge business case to try and get financing into nature from a carbon perspective. And that's happening now. In the last 3 years, a lot has changed, and a lot of people are interested in actually financing carbon projects. Now, there are some challenges, as might be the case with all emerging markets. There are some issues, there are capacity constraints, but it's really appreciable that at least now there is one instrument that is willing to pay for nature conservation. And that's what we're trying to leverage here through the joint creation of this system.
Like, how does somebody get rewarded for the right behavior?
So look, Chhaya, technology can help measure, it can help quantify. What we do with that quantification is an economic, social markets function, right? And it's a governance and political function. So I think we have a big role to play, the important role to play there, all of us, and we need to think about this. So, and you have a very big role to play there, because you, based on your social research and interaction with farmers, need to help all of us think about what is the right incentive structure. Paying for 1 ton of carbon is the model that the world has employed because it's straightforward, it's scalable, but it's not a conclusive model. You could do other models. The green credit is a different model. So we need to think about how to use that measurability and add all these layers of culture, behavior, and then see what's the best way to incentivize. And I don't think we are at the end of that trail. I think we're at the very beginning. At least with measurability, we have a good start now.
So you mentioned two things that we should talk about more, and we all talk about all the time, which is basically, going beyond carbon. Of course, carbon in itself is extremely important, and you were mentioning, Swapan, the other day, the good carbon, the idea of sort of going beyond, and we were discussing the second thing is ecosystem services and how do you value them. Measuring these things have been a very difficult process, but making sure that it doesn't become just a numbers game that anybody can sort of spin to their advantage and not deliver the services that are supposed to be delivered as part of carbon. What are the ways in which you think, the work that you guys are doing can actually address those challenges?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that something that you mentioned is that as actions are undertaken on the ground to plant trees, increase carbon, increase other kinds of benefits of nature, these ecosystem services, claims will be made. Okay, investors or project developers will make claims. So one of the things that we don't want to have false claims, greenwashing. And so what that speaks to very, very much is the idea that we need to have measurements, right? So everything begins in our world, my world, with can you measure it? You can't manage it if you can't measure it, as they say. And so that is true for carbon, and it'll be true for any other ecosystem service, right? So carbon is the first one out of the box because we have some really good metrics. We know how to measure it, and we can report it, and we can be very diligent about assessing claims and really monitoring it to know if we're making any progress and success. The next challenge is going to bring to bring in other things like the biodiversity considerations, and that becomes a lot more complex because ultimately we need metrics and measures for that. One of the tools that's come out in, say, the last 10 years since we've been working together in a big way is this valuation of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services was first highlighted by the Millennial Ecosystem Report. And this report identified the services that nature provides. It provisions, it provides carbon sequestration, it does a lot of things, right? And once identified, then the next challenge was, can you actually figure out how you can measure its impact in economic terms, or dollar terms, if you will, rupee terms in India. And so economists have done really quite a great job at bringing these services into the value spectrum, so we can actually, the economists can link up with our measurements, and if we can identify where these ecosystems are and how they're changing, either with satellite data or traditional ecology on the ground by whatever means, getting indexes like biodiversity indexes which exist in the literature, and then handing them off to the economists, they can then put dollar values on that. And that's been a breakthrough too in the last decade, because that means that we can internalize not only the cost of losing ecosystem services, but also the benefits to us all in kind of terms, whether you like it or not, that people use all the time, economic terms, income terms, things like that. How much does it add to the GNP, for instance? And we're finding out a lot. To be able to monitor the services in detail, like we do with carbon, is the next big agenda, I think. Beyond, that's why you call it, and others call it, beyond carbon, right? How do we move beyond carbon? So we're pushing the momentum that way through carbon, but others are going to have to take up the mantle to get those measures done for other things.
And I think one thing worth mentioning is that even our tree approach that we are taking now, one of the reasons why we continue to work on forest, by the way, but one of the other reasons for us to push a lot on trees outside forest is that there is a direct linkage to livelihoods. Mm-hmm. In almost all countries in the world, especially in India and other developing countries, because a wide majority, if not all of these tree outside forest systems are actually agroforestry homestead garden systems which are linked to the livelihood of smallholder farmers, communities. So now if we can drive investments into these, and if we can use those investment matrices in such a way that they support long rotation trees which have many other benefits of timber, then we are actually ensuring livelihoods to a very large level. Now, like Dave mentions, once we have this system fully calibrated, set in place, then we are also thinking of adding on to this coefficients of other kind of ecosystem service values, which also has to go hand in hand with the demand for those services as it emerges in the world, right? Like, so we are sitting on the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity Credits now. There is a conversation that how do we finance biodiversity? The end goal for all of us ecologists and also economists is that how do you finally end up monetizing the entire stack of ecosystem services that a natural system has to offer, so that it starts competing with diversion, with other uses of that land. And that's what we are working on.
So I have an interesting insight that a wonderful farmer from UP gave me. He had 56 species of trees on his very small plot in Bahraich. And when I was talking to him, Peshkar Chacha is his name, I asked him about measurement. I actually asked him, how many species do you have here? And the reason we know this is because we had an ecologist with us who walked around and actually identified those species. When I asked him that, he says, I don't measure, because if I measure, that means I am actually in my mind kind of like making a decision on what's of value and what's not. And for me, these trees are as much of value to me as my children, and therefore I will not measure them. Which suddenly made me realize that culturally, we're not really attuned, even in our culture, to measure things and then do something about it or value something. We just do because it's so deeply inherent in our, practices or something. So somebody will value a tree because it's a tree to be measured, and it's not just distinct to India. It's actually, I've met people who love trees and would do the same in the US and everywhere else. How do you how do you get beyond the transactional nature of where carbon markets are headed and where forestry, what the desperate funds that forestry is relying upon, to tap into this cultural sentiment that measuring is not what's going to make me conserve and manage?
Well, I guess I would disagree a little bit. I think it's important to do the measurement because it works. But I think what you're saying is that there's more to it. And it's more, trees and forests and nature are more tightly coupled to all of us, to who we are and things that we value that may be even beyond dollars and rupees, right? In fact, there's a project I worked on in Southeast Asia called the INPANG Network. And there, the motivation, and it's a similar project where they're doing carbon, they have carbon in the mix. But what happened was, they were faced with losing natural areas to planting rice, and the rice was grown in such a way they had to borrow from the bank to do it, and they never got out of debt. And their children were leaving for the city, and they just felt like they were the disconnection that occurred between them and nature, even though nature was managed as a production system for these families. I mean, I think we have to accept that it's not always going to be just pure wilderness. That they were losing this connection, and they decided to do something about that, and they implemented this program under the king of Thailand's kind of authority, called the INPANG Network, and we should look it up. And so it was motivated by things that were very social and cultural, and by some, reverence for this, for the king, There was a big champion for the project. And it grew to be something like 10,000 villages in the northeast of Thailand, still operating. So I think there is, it's not a sentiment. It can be a real approach, right? To what you're talking about.
Yeah. Remember like the work in Forest Plus that we tried to do with the monks in Sikkim?
Yes.
To see if monks can influence people. I think there's a bunch of work to be... Okay, we've been talking about measurement, but if we talk about real change and if you want to see large-scale action, I think that's a combination of governance, science, and people action, right? And a lot of that comes from culture and behavior. I mean, that's the set that you work on, and there I think we need to do more to look for approaches to influence this. And I think that doesn't get as much attention because there isn't money to be made, right? There is just action to be done. But there are many organizations which continue to focus on that.
Yeah, and there's precedence. I mean, the Chipko movement, even before that, the Bishnois in India. I mean, there is real precedence for people willing to sacrifice their lives in order to prevent tree cutting.
But there also measurability can help because it can let you assess that, okay, how much of the climate problem is solved. But the driver have to be, in some cases, will be and should be non-financial. They should be just culture, there should be love for nature, passion. This is the reason. Just make the earth beautiful. I mean, those are drivers too, right? That have inspired us over the years. Yeah.
Yesterday, when you were showing that graph about the how you can actually identify every single tree on a farm, I was wondering how far that predictive advisory is to tell farmers which species to plant and where.
The advisory business is slightly more complex because so there are ecological parameters which govern what species to plant. Then there are economic parameters, and then there are social parameters, and you need to work at the overlap of all three of those, right? Ecological parameters, relatively speaking, out of these three are the easiest to quantify, even though they're not easy.
Mm-hmm.
But it still requires building comprehensive databases that in this region, in this condition, what are the right species. We have some other intelligence for certain parts of the world, and we can program that in. Add to that the complexity that those ecological parameters, some of them are going to change now because of climate change. Your precipitation will change, so you can probably model that in. Now come the other two issues. And this is what in our project with NASA we actually tried and made an effort to quantify that what are the social preferences in a region. Is it possible to put them into like measurable empirical data sets so that we can say, all right, this community in these are trees. And while I'm not saying it's not doable, it's not easy because preferences change very drastically. Maybe you should talk about this. In a region, I mean, you probably would have seen that different family sizes, all have different preferences for trees. And then the last thing I want before I hand over to Dave and you is that the market data. There aren't too many comprehensive data sets on markets of tree products. I mean, agri markets in general are not very well recorded, but tree products have even lesser information. So which tree will have demand next year, we don't know. We make guesses. You know, so I think that problems that need to be solved, but a lot more needs to be done in terms of data collection before all these models can be. The models is not a panacea; it requires inputs. So we still need that data.
Yeah, well said, well said. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm not surprised you asked that question, right? And the reason is, it kind of follows this thing that people say a lot, and no good deed goes unpunished. I come here and I present that we can map every tree, and you say, okay, great, now can we map the species, can we determine where to plant it? That's great, I guess. It piqued your enthusiasm, but that's just throwing another challenge in front, right? But that's how it works, right? We make one step forward and there's another one to be made after that, and we need to know which direction to go. And that's why I like working with you guys at IORA and VERTIVER, because we have a great kind of a constellation here, a triumvirate, you know. I come in with some basic science stuff from a university, and then Swapan makes that actionable science by putting it on the ground, and your organization helps explain it and maybe even convince people about the truth of it, you know, about the value of all that, and that's bringing it all together. That kind of integration is really fun and exciting. So yeah.
We love working with you, Dave. We always have. We always learn so much from you. It's amazing.
We always have a good time. It's intellectual. We work hard, and it's a joy too at the same time.
If we could talk a little bit about something that was a recent development, the science-based targets, and how they have now sort of endorsed the offsets under Scope 3 emissions. So I'd love to hear about.
Well, I'll just say this one simple thing. There was no way that nature-based solution, that nature would get into their protocols without that, I don't think. And that's the biggest impact, is that by offsetting, by companies not insetting, which means not having their suppliers change their behavior, which is difficult to do if you don't control their organization, right? But then purchasing offsets means that you can, in terms of offsets, you can bring in all these forestry and tree-based and ecosystem-based, nature-based solutions. There's other kinds of offsets that can be done too, methane flaring and all that kind of stuff. But you open the door for bringing that into science-based targets. How could it be science-based and not consider nature in the big picture? I don't get that. So I think it's a good move.
I think there are two perspectives to this, and I think it's important for us to discuss both. One is that if you were to look at this from a perspective of eventual decarbonization of corporate supply chains, then the more offsets you allow, the more possibility you are creating for corporates not to immediately decarbonize their supply chain. So that's why you see some criticism of this move, right? So that's obviously the case. Of course, by calibrating it very well in corporate plans, now this is the challenge, like who enforces this is the challenge, because all these are voluntary standards, right? We are dealing in a world where all of this is voluntary. You could say that I will only use offsets for 10% of my target and the rest I will decarbonize. So there is a way to use offsets creatively to utilize the idea of the marginal cost of mitigation across geographies, and to also then divert some capital to benefit, like Dave is saying, smallholder farmers who will also absorb the capital in very meaningful ways. Like growing trees is a good way to mitigate climate change, right? So that's there. That's the positive side, that if many of these companies are at the moment struggling to or don't have board corporate level investment mandates to invest heavily in decarbonization, then at least get them to offset and not just walk away from the target. So that's the positive side, that at least you're helping them or making them move into taking some target or the other. So I think we have to keep our sights on both. We need to drive these companies also to decarbonize, otherwise we'll always be in this cycle that they're offsetting but emitting, offsetting but emitting. At the same time, allowing some offsets helps get investments into the sector, at least ensures that targets are being met to some level. So that's my perspective. We've had lots of debates on this in the panels that I am in, and a lot of people are very strongly against or for this. And I've been thinking about this, and I've found it very hard to take an absolute stance on whether it's really bad or really good. But yes, for the larger goals of the planet being, net zero or gross zero, whatever you call it, we need to drive these large emitters towards decarbonization, no doubt about it. Right. But we need pathways for that.
And to that end, you have to see that the Science-Based Targets Initiative is really built around this thing called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has been around a long time. And at first it was very useful, but now it's like, I think we need to be a lot more flexible, right, with that. And if you go back to some other early stuff, I don't know why it's not discussed so much anymore, but there's something called a marginal abatement curve. And the marginal abatement curve tells you what are your options to abate based on the magnitude of the abatement and its cost, right? And when you look at it that way, there's a lot of options out there, a menu of options, and they're not able to be brought on board with the current configuration. This is just a little kind of homage to doing that. And when you look at the full suite of options, nature options are powerful, they're high in magnitude and low in cost. Some are even negative cost, meaning if you implement them, when they're done, they'll save money. So,
and nature options deliver many other benefits. Badav, Steve Water, we've been speaking about that. The final thought on that is that, look, in the long run, there is expectation that a lot of these targets will be replaced by regulated targets, country level caps, taxes, etc. So in some ways, this is also a pathway for companies to prepare for that. Eventually, look, if the world is really serious about decarbonization, we need regulatory caps, but there is a huge economic cost to that, right? So I think that a lot of work is being done, and a lot of countries are looking at how to achieve that status without affecting their economies, which is important as well. And this is a movement in that direction. So we have to continue the movement. We cannot stop it while we allow some flexibility. I think that's the overall goal of these instruments.
Swapan, we're part of the Green Credits Committee in India as well, and I think that's kind of a new instrument that government is trying to do in parallel to that. What are your thoughts on how that is emerging and was created?
Yeah, no, that's actually, we should talk about this because that's a completely in parallel a new move of financial. I think I mentioned biodiversity credits, but there is this move in many countries of the world to start immediately kickstarting instruments which are non-carbon on top of carbon, not to replace carbon, but in addition to carbon, to monetize, value other ecosystem services. So the government of India has actually taken a pioneering role. They've rolled out this instrument, which, I mean, right now it's been rolled out really partially, just one part of that instrument for trees in degraded forests. But if you look at the rules that were notified that a committee did and was working towards, those included a plethora of instruments. So you reward tree plantation, you reward water conservation, air pollution abatement, waste management, and you create a market which allows fungibility of credits across all of these. So imagine having a market that allows for all green actions to participate, And the other cool thing about that instrument, which let us see how far we go in achieving, is that the goal is to voluntarily mobilize demand. Is to explore that are there people, are there companies, are there entities in the country who just care enough about ecology but are not finding a way to invest in it, right? Like an average citizen in Delhi, if you ask them that will you give 1,000 rupees to save our rivers, they might say yes. But then the question is, hey, where do I give it, right? Like I can't go and give 1,000 rupees to a river. So the green credit idea was to actually, make this whole movement retail. And I think it's also linked to Mission Life, which I know you're doing a lot of work on. So what are your thoughts on voluntary actions? Do you see a lot of citizens responding to the campaigns that you do and picking up voluntary actions for climate?
Well, I mean, it would be hubris for me to think that my campaigns could actually somehow turn that into action. But definitely, I think with the government putting so much, basically amplifying the message on how important it is for citizens to get involved in so many activities that are pretty much about mitigation across the sectors like sustainable food systems, and you've got tree plantation, etc. So I do think that there is momentum picking up across India for people to be engaged in some manner or the other. That it's kind of like these conversations about decarbonizing, etc. Lead me to kind of question why it took so long for the world to come to this momentum. And Dave, you've been working in this field for you're one of the pioneers actually in this field. You're looking at climate data. Sometimes I think that I'm going to go crazy because I looked at climate data 20 years ago and how slow the work is being done. Now you go way beyond that and you've been looking at climate data forever. Like, how does it feel to you at a personal level to finally for the world to wake up and say, yes, maybe we agree that some action needs to be done when it seems like it's way too late? How do you even cope with that? I mean, that's something I really have to handle.
No, I think we've made a lot of progress, but there's some real stories to be told about the obstruction of the progress. And when I started working on the global carbon cycle, that was the entry point, till we balanced the global carbon budget. This was in about 1980, 83, 84. And I was a programmer, a modeler, working with some scientists and all that. And there was a handful of people working on that around the world, literally 30 institutions maybe. Yeah, everybody knew everybody, right? Now it's just exploded. Everybody's working on climate change. Even if they're not, they say they are. So which is a good thing, right? I think it's taken that long. I believe very strongly that the science community pushed the policy. I think it was the evidence and what we know about climate change coming from science, specifically the work of the IPCC, and how that then transitioned into, policy. The early IPCC reports were just, here's what we understand, and there were a lot of gaps, right? So as all those people kind of came together and crowdsourced this problem, we learned more. And then the IPCC went through a process of saying what's certainty or uncertainty, and they came up in, 10 years ago starting saying this is certain, right? So it took a little bit of time just to get our act together and get organized and get some key things studied, right? But then, as we made progress, it was obstructed, chiefly in the United States. It turned into a problem to be solved with Yankee ingenuity, perhaps, right? That's what we say. It was a problem to be solved to a political issue. And the lineup is red or blue. You're for climate change, you're on the left. If you're against it, you're on the right. In fact, you can't be on the right and be for fixing climate change, right? So there's a lot that's been studied on how that happened. And I remember when a key politician in the United States, two key politicians, I can name them, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, and Newt Gingrich, who became Speaker of the House during the Republican era, did a commercial both for let's do something about climate change.
Oh, wow.
How could that have changed? It changed because there was concerted action by interest groups to obscure the information, right? And that put a period of time that just delayed everything. It's horrible, I think. And we've never gotten back to a point where it's just a problem that needs to be solved. Fortunately, it's getting into the sphere that Swapan is working in and knows about. It's becoming the opportunity space to do things. And so you get the financial institutions coming in
Yeah.
and so forth. Well, thank God for the opportunity, because now we're getting back on to doing serious business.
So, but you were telling me that there was some kind of a football field analogy that they had come up with. What was that?
He should tell you. It was
So at that time, my boss, a professor, I had a professor who hired a lot of us right out of school, even though we didn't have like advanced degrees. We all had masters. But he turned the lab over to us to do things. He gave us a lot of leeway, and he was a great leader, so we had a good mentor. He was invited to this big meeting, Balaton Group or something like that, a big meeting on climate change. He came to me, "You're doing all this work on deforestation. What do I say to them? How do I won't get much time, everybody's talking." And I said, okay, I'll figure it out. And I came back and I said, I did a calculation. The rate of deforestation is football field a second. I meant American football in that, okay, just to be sure. And it's like I said, when you're sitting there, tell them when you're sitting watching the clock tick down, it's seconds going by. Each second, that space in front of you is being deforested, right?
I remember that.
So that was, he said, that's great, okay. And then they had the meeting turned into the cover of Time Magazine. And they used football field second on Time Magazine, in the article on Time Magazine. But, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But, it's nothing you can prove. It's how these things that happen. Somebody else can say, no, I thought it up, I suppose. But I know that actually happened that way.
Of this measurability talk is making me think of a number of trees. Like, how many trees do we have in India right now?
Yeah.
Do we know this?
No.
Or how many trees do we need to get to? I mean, how do we know about carbon but not about the number of trees?
Yeah,
It's a hard problem, actually.
keep looking.
Is it?
These are all the things our platform will answer. So keep watching that.
Yeah,
space.
We don't know where the biggest tree is either.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't?
No, of course not. I did a thing for a seminar, a class exercise at Michigan State University. And it was an exercise. I posed to the students, if I asked you where is the biggest tree in Africa, how would you approach that problem? It was kind of interesting. Of course, it had to do with satellites and remote sensing at some point. But no, we don't know where the biggest tree is. We don't know how many trees there are.
Isn't there like a tree that is kilometers wide? It's a banyan tree.
Yeah, but you can't never conclude it's the biggest. Maybe the biggest one has never been seen.
Oh, that's true.
Or the tallest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Could be. I know what you're talking about, though. I've heard those stories. But maybe it's always good to have some unknowns.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
I was just going to say, maybe you don't need to know. Maybe you just assume that the biggest tree is out there. And
Yeah.
we just...
So yeah, I'm just wondering, like,
we
if
just
there
need
is-
to make sure it doesn't get cut.
It's just, I was going to say, just out there waiting to be cut.
No, I'm just wondering, like,
Basket.
if a certain number of people, and there's a lot of people in India, like let's say 500 million people
Yeah.
chose to plant like 4 trees each, is there enough water and is there enough land to
Yeah.
plant those trees? Is I'm just curious about, but this is something.
It's an interesting question. Firstly, it will be an amazing problem to solve if we have to stop people from planting more trees. I mean, we are clearly very far away from that. Yeah, and secondly, I mean, trees help. I mean, in some areas, trees will get you more water and more soil, right?
Yeah.
Versus the opposite.
Yeah.
So yeah, trees are an amazing
Right.
instrument to fight everything.
Well, on that note of the known unknowns and unknown knowns, here we conclude our conversation. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Dr.
it's been
Skole,
great.
for being here.
Great.
It's really been a great conversation. Thank you, Swapan. We both are so grateful to have you in our office.
Mhm.
It's almost like a
Pleasure is
blessing to
all
have you.
mine.
Thank you so much.